and this time I'm looking at introduction to the system. So these talks were based on the core modules of the Observer Stroke Associates Handbook, you know, the thing that associates get, and we do as observers, that say these are the kind of subjects that you should be covering. And the idea of this was very simple from my initial starting point, is that this would cover those things and be part of our observer training. A little bit about me. I look after observer training here in Northampton in our local group. I'm a retired IT consultant, so instead of doing the gardening, I've spent most of the week creating graphics and things for this because it's much more interesting than gardening. 2 or 3 years, well, a couple of years ago now, I retired. Well, to be precise, I was made redundant and then worked out I could just about afford to retire, and that was more interesting than being an IT consultant. So I immediately qualified as an ADI with the idea I could use my experience as an observer and actually have a paid income, and then decided I really didn't want to teach 17-year-olds to drive, so I've never got around to actually doing that. But I do a lot of voluntary things outside. So I started volunteering, helping with reading at a primary school. I'm now a governor of that school. I'm also a local magistrate now. But that's about me. That's got nothing to do with the talk, really. But this is how what you will notice in there is not an expert on anything to do with driver theory or anything like that. This is something I created, and the original idea was to run these presentations past other observers and trainee observers and get comments and road test the presentations. Since then, it grew a little bit. So I very welcome all these people from up and down the country. That's great. But it's slightly bigger. So anybody who actually wants an introduction to IPSCAR, this isn't quite it. This is meant to be a discussion for fellow observers, particularly trainee observers, to go back over IPSCAR and just think about it in a bit more detail, because we've probably encountered it when we've done our training, but not really considered it in any depth. So that's the starting point of this from an observer training point of view, not from an associate training point of view. However, we are going to talk about it in some detail. What I'm not going to talk about is how we apply it in every possible scenario, you know, how we do it on a roundabout, how we do this on corners and bends or whatever. That's covered elsewhere, I dare say. Now, I am assuming that you know what IPSCAR is. So altogether, what does IPSCAR stand for?
Information,
Position, speed,
position, gears,
acceleration.
Fantastic, fantastic. I had one or two people mumbling their way through there, but I think that was good. That was very, very good. So there we go. And this is my version of the diagram for it. Information, as you said, taking, using, and giving information, and position, speed, gear, and acceleration. Fantastic. We tend to have that ingrained into us at some point during our advanced driver training. Now, let's split those out a bit. Let's kind of split those into two for a moment, because the first thing I would contend here is that it's not one, but it's two systems. Two for the price of one deal. What could be better? On the left-hand side, we've got the information phase. Now, that's somewhat cerebral. That's that you can see the cogs. I don't know if those cogs whir quite as well over the Zoom link.
Yeah, it looks
but
good.
The cogs are whirring away there, and this is a kind of process that's ongoing all the way through the system. It's high frequency. There are going to be multiple cycles before you arrive at the hazard of doing that one. So you're taking in, it's lots of analogies here, being an ex-IT consultant, to data processing and so on. Whereas the other track, well, that's more about vehicle control. It's changing position. It's changing your speed. It's changing gear. It's a kind of sequence of events that has to be gone through. And while they're related, of course they're related, changing your position will give you more information. The information you gain will help you decide what's the appropriate speed and therefore the right gear. Of course, they're related, but they're happening separately. And again, back to the frequency of this one is generally 1 per hazard. Obviously, we can restart the system if we need to. If the information dictates something comes up and we need to restart, we need to change the speed, we need to change our position, we can restart from any point. But the kind of default is a frequency of once per hazard, unlike the information phase, which is much more high frequency or low wavelength, if you so. So far, so good. Now, bear with me for a minute, this idea that we haven't got one, but we've actually got 2 systems, because one of the questions I think that we have to answer with our associates, with any trainees, is why on earth are we doing this? Why are we going for this particular system? Now, I'm going to consider it as both parts. I'm going to start with this right-hand one, position, speed, gear. And there we are. We should have a diagram there with position, speed, gear. We're in the blue car. And I'm now going to use my wonderful laser pointer. There we go. That should appear. Anybody see it? Oh, amazing.
Yep.
There it is. Here's where we're going to come into conflict with the red car. Okay, what's he going on about here? Well, this is our hazard. This is the danger zone. This is where there's a higher probability of us having a collision. Now, what we're trying to achieve by doing this is this. This is the minefield. Once we get past this dotted line, this zone boundary, we're in the mire, we're in the minefield. So by the time we get there, I want us to have maximum control of the car or full control of the car, but we need to be able to take whatever action is necessary within there and not be concerned with other controls. So by the time we're there, in order to do that, we need our hands back on the wheel so we can steer effectively. We need to be in the correct gear. So if we need to accelerate or slightly decelerate, we're in the right gear. And of course, we need to be at the right speed. So this part of the system is giving us full control once we're in that danger zone. And effectively, as I said before, it's counting down. In order to be in that position, by the time we cross into the danger zone, into the minefield, we must have got into the right gear. In order to have got to the right gear, we must have got to the right speed. And before we did that, we must have got in the right position on the road. So we've got to kind of start these things in a phase before we go, but it's sequential and it works up to that point. Okay, that's straightforward, and all get that. What about the other system, the one about information that's going on in parallel? So we're cycling our way through this, obviously not cycling, we are going through this information taking, using and giving information all the way up to the danger zone. And we're updating our information as we go, and that will change our decision as we get there. When we start on the left-hand side, now obviously limited by the size of the screen, but we might be, what, quarter of a mile away when we first notice there's a major junction coming up or something. When we first encounter it, the warning sign might as well say, "Here be dragons," because we don't have enough information about this. Here be dragons, as I'm sure you're aware, is what sort of early cartographers used on their maps when they knew some area was dangerous, but they didn't know anything about it. Ships had just disappeared there. So the obvious answer, it must be dragons. But this is a bit like what we're doing. And as we work our way through, we gain information and we can see what's going on. So what this is doing for us is it's giving us more time. It's giving us more time to anticipate what's happening, to prioritize what we're going to do about it, and decide what our actions are going to be. So this seems straightforward. Now, if you talk to people who've either been in a collision or people who investigate collision, the difference between a collision, a near miss, and nothing really happening at all might well be seconds. And so by the time we get to that zone there where the red car kind of is impacting with the blue, if we've managed to do all these things and save ourselves some seconds in this bit, that might make all the difference. And that's why it's kind of important. So why is this so hard? You know, we spend a lot of our time with associates kind of training them up to be systematic and use this. So what are common faults? Now, unlike the IPSCA, I'm not going to get you to shout out, but if you did, I bet some of these things would be on your list. Observation. They're not really looking early enough. Brake gear overlap. Everything's somewhat compressed. They land up braking and changing gear at the same time. Speed. They brake too late. They come home to the hazard too fast. And then they have to brake at the last minute. And then they might land up brake gear overlapping. Or they might just do a rushed gear change in order to do that. Or the gear change happens on the hazard. Or there's no real planning. They kind of arrive there and then they have a good look and then decide what to do. Does this sound familiar? These sort of things you find?
Yeah.
I think anybody who's an observer has seen these, but changing ingrained habits is hard. So why have people got to this stage? Why have we got to this point where something that looks fairly straightforward is quite difficult to do? The question sometimes is asked, so what are you teaching learner drivers then if this is so difficult? And don't they have a system? Well, of course they have a system. And if you ask any learner driver, have that sort of conversation with anybody who's learned to drive, mirror signal maneuver. There we go, mirror signal maneuver. Who hasn't heard of this at some stage? You know, I'm sure it's in the highway code and various other things. Mirror signal maneuver, like that's some sort of answer to it. But actually, these days that gets expanded somewhat. Mirror signal obviously is there. Maneuver gets further extended, particularly into position, speed, and look. It's nice and simple. You can do things in a particular sequence, and very often the final one gets further expanded to something like this: looking and assessing, deciding and acting. So now looking at this doesn't look too dissimilar to our system, because, okay, we've got a little bit of information happening here, mirror and signal. Up there, I'll go back to my laser pointer. Up there, we've got mirror, and then we've got signal, and then we've got changing position, then we've got changing speed, and actually this encompasses gear. It deals with automatics, but it also sort of says, right, once you're at a new speed, then you should consider a new gear if appropriate. And then finally, we've got looking, assessing, deciding, and acting. So if there's one thing that happens with this, well, first of all, it now maps on to our IPSCA pretty much, except for looking, assessing, deciding, and acting, where it would be nice if those sorts of things happen much earlier, if we started doing them while we're doing this position, speed, and so on. Then we would, it would be more like IPSCA. We're simply moving those things a little bit earlier. Hang on though, it still hasn't quite answered why people consistently have a problem with this one. Now I'm using this model. I'm just going to go on to the next slide. When people learn to drive, you always have somebody with you, ideally an instructor, but it might be your mum or your dad or whatever. And so they will tend to give you instructions, typically along the lines of, at the end of the road, turn left. Now, if you're a driving instructor, or the one thing that was drummed into me, you give that instruction to your spare mirror, the one that you've got stuck on the dashboard, not on the dashboard, on the windscreen, looking at their face, looking at their eyes. Because the first thing you want to see them do, the minute you say at the end of the road, turn left, they should check their mirror. And the very next thing they should do is signal. And if they don't, you're encouraged to say something like, where are we going to look before we do anything else? And they, oh, mirror. Do we need to give a signal? Oh yes, there was a car behind. Right, we'll give a signal. They're constantly being reminded. If they don't get in the right position, your mum, your dad, or the instructor is going to say, oh, a bit to the left, oh, towards the middle, or whatever. And if they're going a bit fast, it's going to be, oh, what's your speed here? What speed do you think's right? And what gear? And then finally, they spend a lot of time making decisions, where are they going to look, and so on. So here's my question. If you didn't have anybody to remind you, so you've done all this, you've had your, 40, 50 odd hours driving instruction, you pass your test, and then a few years in, which bits are going to fade? Which bits are going to fade if there's nobody to remind you? So, system. Well, you might not consider it as a system because that's just how you drive. Doesn't really matter too much. Mirror. Now I contend that actually about, 75% of the time, maybe more, if you didn't check your mirror, nothing untoward would happen in a lot of cases. Certainly if you have got white van man following you sort of 3 feet from your bumper and you suddenly turn left without checking, well, they might helpfully remind you with a beep of their horn. But in most cases, the fact that you didn't check the mirror, probably you won't get a reminder. So I can see that fading a bit. Signaling depends. Again, if you've got white van man and you suddenly switch into another lane in front of them and take them by surprise, they might helpfully remind you. But if you live in London, no, forget that. There's a real need for signalling there. Or obviously, if you drive an Audi, I don't think they don't have the indicators, do they?
Him anyway.
So that's going to fade definitely. Positioning. Well, that depends. If you're turning left at a T junction and you were slightly out, not quite there, makes no difference. On the other hand, if you're on a major roundabout and you try and turn right from the left-hand lane, almost certainly somebody will helpfully remind you that you probably should have given the signal. Speed. That's an interesting one because nobody is going to remind you of that directly, probably. However, the first few times you drive solo and there isn't somebody saying, slow down a bit for this bend, you try it faster and faster and you get away with it until it rains or something untoward happens, or the bend is slightly sharper than you thought it was. And then you go through the hedge. This is one of the most common types of collisions for new drivers. Surprise, surprise. Single car accidents with a bit of the scenery. I don't think that's the official title.
Is that what it is?
Looking, assessing, deciding. Well, these things get slightly better because now, maybe not the looking and assessing, but deciding and acting, well, they have much, much more practice in doing those things. So it becomes semi-automatic in doing those things. They're not going to be quite so hesitant at roundabouts, junctions, whatever, and you go in that. So we can see now, with that in mind, think about if you had the average associate, the average trainee comes to you as an observer. I would contend that they use their mirror, but not as much as they should do. Their positioning is generally good, but not for all situations, and certainly not all the situations we might want to encourage them to change position from an advanced point of view. But generally, particularly roundabouts, they're generally okay. Speed, generally okay, but probably come into the hazards a bit fast because they've improved this bit. They've improved their looking and assessing. Therefore, they can come hammering up to it and make a decision at the last minute more effectively. So the speed bit got closer and closer and closer to the hazard. And the looking and assessing has got better. Does that sound like the average associate? Because I think that sort of ticks those sorts of boxes. Okay, come back to that in a moment. So what about our system? What about roadcraft and our system again? Where on earth did that come from? Now, being a bit of a nerd, I have bought 1 or 2 copies of roadcraft. I think I own 4 of them. This is not the earliest one, but it's the earliest one I own. It's roadcraft, the one that was published in 1960. And I love it. It cost 3 shillings and 6pence net. You could get it from Her Majesty's Stationery Office, and it's got that beautiful picture of a, I don't know which, somebody could fill me in actually, I don't know what sort of car it is.
It looks like a Wolsey.
Yeah, thank you. I knew somebody would do that, be able to do that. What I love is the sort of light thing on the top, but more particularly the bell there to get you through the traffic. You know, it looks slightly menacing there, turning slightly to the left there. Now, the system is course. Well, actually, a lot of instructors would put the word mirror in front of it, because actually in the book it just says course, but if you lurch into another lane, as I say, you really should have checked your mirrors. So then it said mirror signal speed, then it said gear, mirror signal, horn, accelerate. And this worked reasonably well. Now, I first passed an advanced test in my 20s back in 1980 something, 86, and this was still the system in place. Roadcraft had been updated at least once since then, and it's been updated a couple of times since, but this was the system that I had to rigidly learn. Now, this has a couple of issues with it, and it's quickly changing to a pen. Now, far be it from me to suggest that, apart from me, the IAM attracts pedants and nerds. That could never be the case. But in some cases, this system didn't quite work. This is heresy, or it was definitely heresy at the time. Now, imagine you have to follow this system down. So I'm coming up to a hazard. Let's say, for the sake of argument, I don't know, a roundabout. I know this isn't a roundabout, but it is. So at this point, I do mirror, signal, and speed. Okay, so now I'm slowing down, I'm changing gear. Somewhere in that part, another car comes into view. Maybe somebody at the next, say it was a roundabout, at the next entry point onto the roundabout, the next road. So there's at that point, there's another vehicle. But the pedants would have it that I can't signal to them until I get to this phase down here, mirror signal, at which point I'm nearly on the junction. So I then religiously, because it's switch on my indicator, and they go, oh, thanks, because they've been hanging around for me, and then they actually could have they could have gone 10 minutes ago or whatever long it took to slow down. So now this point was argued with me with a chief observer of a group I was in. He had all sorts of good reasons why you must only signal there or only signal here. And it blatantly didn't make any sense. But nevertheless, we can all be pedants on these things. There was another one. I'm just going to get rid of all the scribble on here. And there was another case where we say, okay, we will always do this system. This is what we apply. You may not to do everything. But about just after I passed, I became an observer and went on a course at with the Greater Manchester Police, but again, back late 80s. And they were saying, oh yeah, that's where I got this. We always put mirror in front of the word course. They said, oh, what about a humpback bridge? So let's imagine this isn't a junction. This is a humpback bridge. This is a humpback bridge. And so there's our humpback bridge. Let's use the artwork. So you can't see over that, if that makes any sense. So you're coming down here, you're doing mirror course. Okay, we slow down, we get the right gear, we check the mirror again. And only when we're kind of there do you give a horn warning. And they say, oh no, that's blatant, because at that point, your horn warning only to be met by the car coming the other way. That serves no useful purpose whatsoever. What we'll do is, for these sorts of hazards, we'll move that up. I think it was here, or it might have been after mirror signal speed, or it might have been after horn. Either way, under certain circumstances, we'll change the order of the system. So not only do you remember this drill, but actually, under certain circumstances, we're going to change it. So you can see it's got a few issues in there. So what happened then is it obviously swapped at some point to the version that we've got now for the system. And this happened in this version of Roadcraft, which happened in 1994. And although this has been updated since, the order of the system that happens the write-up has changed completely, but the order that we do the actions has changed. And the main thing is that we have this separate information phase going on. So you can see what's gone. The mirror signal bit goes into information. The gear, the course changes its name to position, speed is there, gear is there, mirror and signal goes into information. Horn has gone into information. And then finally we've got accelerate. So what we're seeing is that information phase and the fact that that can be used completely flexibly. The real clue, though, is in the write-up, because in the text, in the Roadcraft of 1960, it was very police ease. It's like Dixon Dot Green, a system or drill, each feature of which is to be considered in sequence by the driver at the approach to hazards. We had a discussion on the observer's course I went on back in the late 80s, which was still using this system at the time at the police driving school in Manchester. One of the discussions was, one of the driving instructors said, yeah, we have it slightly easier here because the view we take is if you're a police driver, you're driving the chief constable's car. You will do it this way. You will go through this. We've got the slightly more difficult state where we need to convince people this is a good way of doing it, an appropriate way of doing it. When I came to find a comparative piece of text in the current version of Roadcraft 2013, it's much more nuanced, much more wordy. The system of car control is a way of approaching and negotiating hazards, that it's methodical, safe, leaves nothing to chance. It involves careful observation, early anticipation and planning, and a systematic use of the controls to maintain, and it goes on. It's much, much more nuanced. Eventually it says, it has a flexible element. You, the driver, it's stressing the flexibility of it. It's no longer an absolute drill. It's about how the driver negotiates it and uses it intelligently. So I've massively condensed what it says in Roadcraft to this. We still need to consider all the phases of the system, and we may not need to use all of them all of the time. We're taking, using, and giving information all the time. That's cycles round that one. We're constantly reassessing our plans, and we are allowed to go back to an earlier stage of the system if it becomes appropriate. So flexibility is key here. Now, I think this gives us a challenge, a problem, if you will, for observers, because when we're trying to teach people to do this, we have to be methodical and we have to be consistent. So we must, very typically, when we're first starting out with a new associate, we tend to stick to being methodical, stick to going rigidly through the system until they're consistent, so that the associate can apply the system unthinkingly, really, to be able to do this in every circumstance. It's second nature. But we need them to be flexible as well. We know they need to know that they can vary it and when to vary it, when it's okay to overlap and so on. They need to be able to adapt to new situations. In other words, applying it intelligently. So when we have this balance, it's going to come down slightly on the side of flexibility within this. Now, this is nearly all I'm going to say about IPSCAR, but there is one thing that I do need to just mention. Now, this is mandatory. I found this in the annals of the IAM, that if you have more than 2 observers gathered together, it is actually mandatory. You have to discuss signalling and when not to do it. And so I don't know why. It is an ancient rule. It goes back, I've studied this a bit. It actually goes back, I think, to the 11th century. Signaling, I believe the rules about signalling came over with William the Conqueror. I don't know if you can see the animation there. This is from the Bayeux Tapestry, and this shows William the Conqueror clearly giving a hand signal, which apparently historians have translated it as, "I intend to invade Hastings." Other historians reckon this says, "Watch what you're doing with that bloody bow and arrow. You'll have somebody's eye out in a minute." Anyway, that's enough of the historical jokes. Having looked at this a bit, I have studied ye ancient roadcraft, and by rendering it in Old English script, I realise it's almost impossible to read. However, I will read the relevant bits to you. First bit. Give a signal if it could help other road users, including pedestrians and cyclists. Use indicators, the horn, or flash your lights. Give your warning signal in good time for maximum benefit. Absolutely nothing to argue with there. In fact, the only bits I would draw your attention to, if it could help other road users. So it doesn't say it must help other road users, or it's a little bit less definite than that. It could help other road users. And the other thing I would drag out of this is road users. It doesn't say road users in a motorized vehicle. It then goes on to flesh it out and say pedestrians and cyclists, but it could also say horses, skateboard, whatever, other road users. So anybody around who would benefit from a signal, definitely do it if you think anybody might benefit. Now, this bit is the bit that causes all the trouble, I suspect. So I'm going to take it in chunks. Chunk 1, use observation to anticipate when a signal may be needed. Completely happy with that. Use observation to anticipate when a signal might be needed. Yeah, we like anticipation, that's good. And planning that you're going to use a signal is probably a good thing. That's part of your planning phase. Sounds good to me, all good. This encourages you to be aware of other road users at all times, especially those behind you. Yeah, absolutely nothing wrong with that. Yes, we absolutely must encourage our associates to be aware of all the other motorists, all the other traffic around them, and particularly those behind them. All good. It's this last sentence that I think causes all the arguments. It also reduces unnecessary hand movements and signal clutter. What? It also reduces unnecessary hand movements and signal clutter? What on earth is that? Now, let's take the first bit. Unnecessary hand movements. I shall now, yes, thank you, John. That's exactly what I was thinking of. But you printed it, right? This is me putting on a signal. The only unnecessary hand movement here was me trying to film it while one-handed while putting the indicator on. It uses one finger. There you go, click, there you go. I'll do the sound effects, click. That's it. That's my, as John kindly illustrated, that the only unnecessary hand movement, I suspect, would be from the other motorist if I hadn't done it. Signal clutter, does that mean unnecessary signaling? Yeah, but I don't know really. No, signaling unnecessary to go around some parked cars, that should be dealt with elsewhere if it's necessary. Anyway, so the final bit, it says, is if in doubt, it's better to signal than not to signal. It's better to signal than not to signal, obviously. Now, I know I've laboured this point somewhat, but my worry is, and I've seen it in a few cases, is that some associates get confused and land up worried about signalling. Now, we've all seen people who automatically click the signal on the phone. Doesn't really matter too much as long as we're aware that they are aware of all the vehicles around them, and we encourage them to think about that. But we must make sure that we're not actually preventing or discouraging associates, trainees from actually signalling, which I think sometimes is the case. Okay, I realise I'm running slightly over time, but luckily that was the last part of it. In summary, the system that we just described and why frames most of what we teach. So it's worth having an idea why we're doing those things. So when we're putting that over to our new associates, I think it helps to think of it as 2 for the price of 1. The thinking part, taking, using, and giving out information, and the car control part, position, speed, gear, and accelerate. And in fact, when we do our on-the-road training, when you think about it, a lot of this is thinking, planning to stop, looking to go, all that sort of stuff is in the thinking part. A lot of what we do in checking the position, dealing with slowing down gracefully, use of brakes and so on, smooth gear change. This is all in this part of car control. We want, by the end of our training, we want the associate, the driver, to be able to use the system flexibly, but not too flexibly. We still want them to carry on doing the system wherever possible. And finally, don't discourage signaling. And that's my, that's me done. So I'm going to end the sharing bit, and I just welcome any comments and things. So I'm going to stop sharing on that.